Atlanta, Georgia. What would you do if your entire future was stolen from you based on a lie? Maya Thompson sat stiffly in the courtroom, her hands clenched together under the table. Just a week ago, she'd been preparing for her biggest debate tournament, ready to prove once again why she was one of the best students at Eastwood High. Now, she was here, on trial for a crime she didn't commit. The weight of the accusations pressed down on her. Possession of drugs on school property, a charge that could not only expel her but ruin everything she had worked for. Her future, her dreams, her shot at becoming a lawyer, all of it could be gone in a matter of minutes. She lifted her eyes, scanning the room. The judge sat high above them, flipping through a file without much interest. The prosecutor, a man in a neatly pressed suit, smirked slightly as he organized his notes. Maya's school principal sat near the front, arms crossed, refusing to even look in her direction. He had already made up his mind about her. Her parents sat behind her, their faces tight with worry. Her mother's eyes glistened, her father's jaw locked in frustration. They knew, just as Maya did, that this was a setup. Because Maya Thompson would never throw away her future. She was the top student in her class, captain of the debate team, already in talks with Ivy League schools for a full-ride scholarship. She wasn't the kind of student who got into trouble, and yet, here she was, accused of something that didn't make sense. The bag of pills had been found in her locker. An anonymous tip had led the principal straight to it. No one had seen her put it there. No cameras had captured her doing anything wrong. And yet, she was expected to defend herself against a case that had already been decided in everyone else's minds. She had one advantage, though. She had spent years studying cases just like this, where the system failed, where innocent people were punished for things they didn't do, and if no one else was going to fight for her, she would fight for herself. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The judge peered down at her, finally setting the file aside. "Ms. Thompson, do you understand the charges against you?" Maya took a deep breath, forcing herself to sit up straight. She wasn't going to cower. She wasn't going to break. "Yes, Your Honor," she said firmly, "but I also understand that I was framed." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor's smirk disappeared. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Maya had their attention now, and she wasn't going to waste it. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it?" Maya Thompson sat in silence, staring straight ahead as the prosecutor continued listing the charges against her. She barely heard him. The words didn't matter because she already knew the truth. This was a setup. Maya had spent years proving she was the best. She had out-argued her opponents in debate tournaments, outperformed her classmates academically, and spoken out against the school's unfair policies targeting black students. Her voice had power, and that had made people uncomfortable, especially Principal Leland. He and a group of wealthy parents had never liked Maya's outspokenness. She had questioned too many policies, protested too many decisions. When she led a movement to expose how students like her were disciplined more harshly than their white peers, she became a problem, and problems got dealt with. One morning, Maya had been sitting in homeroom when the announcement came. Random locker searches. A routine procedure. She hadn't thought much of it, until security stopped at her locker. She watched as they opened it, their hands moving with too much confidence, too much certainty. Seconds later, they pulled out a plastic bag filled with pills. Maya's stomach dropped. She had never seen that bag in her life. Confused, she turned to the principal, who stood nearby with his arms crossed. "That's not mine," she had said, her voice steady, despite the way her hands had begun to shake. Principal Leland didn't hesitate. He just turned to security and said, "Call the police." That was it. No questions, no investigation, just an assumption of guilt. Maya had barely been able to process what was happening before uniformed officers arrived. They pulled her out of class in front of everyone. Her classmates, her teachers, people who had once respected her. She had never felt so exposed, so powerless. She had tried to explain, tried to insist that it wasn't hers, that someone had planted it, but no one had listened. The principal had already decided her fate, and the police had followed his lead. In the days that followed, the whispers started. Her friends texted her less. Teachers who had once praised her looked away when she passed them in the hallways. The weight of the accusation clung to her, suffocating every part of her life. Her scholarship applications were suddenly under review. College recruiters who had been eager to meet her stopped calling. The future she had worked for her entire life was slipping away, all because of a lie. Now, standing in court, she realized it wasn't just Principal Leland against her. It was the entire system. But what they didn't know, Maya was smarter than they thought. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to prove them all wrong. Maya Thompson sat in silence, staring straight ahead as the prosecutor continued listing the charges against her. She barely heard him. The words didn't matter because she already knew the truth. This was a setup. Maya had spent years proving she was the best. She had out-argued her opponents in debate tournaments, outperformed her classmates academically, and spoken out against the school's unfair policies targeting black students. Her voice had power, and that had made people uncomfortable, especially Principal Leland. He and a group of wealthy parents had never liked Maya's outspokenness. She had questioned too many policies, protested too many decisions. When she led a movement to expose how students like her were disciplined more harshly than their white peers, she became a problem. And problems got dealt with. One morning, Maya had been sitting in homeroom when the announcement came. Random locker searches. A routine procedure. She hadn't thought much of it, until security stopped at her locker. She watched as they opened it, their hands moving with too much confidence, too much certainty. Seconds later, they pulled out a plastic bag filled with pills. Maya's stomach dropped. She had never seen that bag in her life. Confused, she turned to the principal, who stood nearby with his arms crossed. "That's not mine," she had said, her voice steady, despite the way her hands had begun to shake. Principal Leland didn't hesitate. He just turned to security and said, "Call the police." That was it. No questions, no investigation, just an assumption of guilt. Maya had barely been able to process what was happening before uniformed officers arrived. They pulled her out of class in front of everyone, her classmates, her teachers, people who had once respected her. She had never felt so exposed, so powerless. She had tried to explain, tried to insist that it wasn't hers, that someone had planted it. But no one had listened. The principal had already decided her fate, and the police had followed his lead. In the days that followed, the whispers started. Her friends texted her less. Teachers who had once praised her looked away when she passed them in the hallways. The weight of the accusation clung to her, suffocating every part of her life. Her scholarship applications were suddenly under review. College recruiters who had been eager to meet her stopped calling. The future she had worked for her entire life was slipping away, all because of a lie. Now, standing in the court, she realized it wasn't just Principal Leland against her. It was the entire system. But what they didn't know, Maya was smarter than they thought. She wasn't just going to defend herself, she was going to prove them all wrong. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, students, and teachers filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the girl who had once been the school's rising star. Now, she stood trial, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The prosecutor smirked, pacing in front of the jury. "Maya Thompson, do you deny that the drugs were found in your locker?" Maya stood up, her voice steady. "I deny that they were mine." Judge Wallace narrowed his eyes. "Then how do you explain the evidence?" Maya took a deep breath. "Easy. Someone put them there." The audience murmured. Some teachers exchanged nervous glances, while a few students nodded, as if they had already suspected as much. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice sharp. "Order in the court." Maya turned, her eyes blazing as she looked straight at the prosecutor. "Stop lying about me. I'm not a criminal." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the judge hesitated, momentarily thrown off by her boldness. Maya had just taken control of the case. The courtroom was tense, the weight of the trial pressing down on everyone in the room. The prosecutor had been relentless. The judge had remained skeptical. And Maya knew that if she didn't act now, she might lose everything. She took a steady breath, standing tall. "Your Honor," she said, reaching into her bag, "I'd like to submit new evidence." Every head in the courtroom turned as she pulled out a small USB drive. The defense lawyer, who had been reviewing his notes, looked up, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Maya smirked, the first real sign of confidence she had shown since the trial began. "I have friends in the tech club." Judge Wallace raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is on that drive, Miss Thompson?" Maya stepped forward, her hands steady, as she placed the USB on the evidence table. "This," she said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "is security footage from the school." The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Principal Leland, who had been sitting near the back, straightened in his chair, his hands tightening into fists. The judge gestured to the bailiff, who took the drive and plugged it into the courtroom's display system. The screen flickered to life. The video feed showed a dimly lit school hallway, time-stamped the morning of the search. The camera angle focused on Maya's locker. The courtroom held its breath. A figure stepped into the frame. Principal Leland. Gasps rippled through the audience. The jury leaned forward, eyes glued to the screen. The footage was clear. Leland glanced around nervously, reached into his pocket, and stuffed a small plastic bag into Maya's locker before quickly walking away. Maya folded her arms, waiting. The judge's face darkened. He turned toward the principal, his voice sharp. "Mr. Leland, would you care to explain this?" The principal's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Finally, he stammered, "This is taken out of context." A murmur spread through the crowd, some people shaking their heads in disbelief. The jury exchanged looks, their expressions shifting from skepticism to understanding. The truth was undeniable. The prosecutor ran a hand down his face, his case unraveling before his eyes. He had built his argument on the assumption that Maya was guilty, but now, with this evidence, there was no doubt. She had been framed. Maya met the principal's panicked gaze, her voice steady. "You set me up," she said, "and now everyone knows it." The walls of corruption were crumbling. Maya had just flipped the case upside down. The prosecutor, once brimming with confidence, now looked visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes, searching for an argument that no longer existed. "This doesn't prove anything," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. Maya didn't miss a beat. she reached into her bag once more, this time pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Oh, really?" she said, her tone sharp. "Because I also have proof that Mr. Leland emailed the school board about handling me." The judge gestured for the bailiff to collect the paper. As the judge scanned the document, his expression darkened. The room was so silent that Maya could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Judge Wallace cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "We cannot allow Maya Thompson to keep disrupting school policies. If we find something on her, she'll be out of our hands for good." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, their faces shifting from skepticism to outrage. Reporters scrambled to take notes, some already rushing to draft headlines. In the back of the room, Principal Leland's face turned ghostly pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly, his entire body frozen in place. The defense lawyer leaned back, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is the clear evidence of a targeted attack against my client. Maya Thompson was framed. We request that all charges be dropped immediately." The judge exhaled deeply, his gaze shifting toward the prosecutor, who now sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. The weight of the case had shifted entirely, and there was no recovering from it. "I believe," the judge said, rubbing his temple, "that's the only course of action." He turned toward Maya. "Miss Thompson, you are cleared of all charges. This court apologizes for the injustice brought against you." A cheer erupted from the gallery. Students, teachers, and reporters murmured excitedly, their whispers carrying the undeniable truth. Maya had just exposed one of the biggest scandals in the school's history. She turned to her parents, who sat behind her, tears brimming in her mother's eyes. Her father gave her a nod of approval, pride written all over his face. Maya had done it. She had exposed them all. The courtroom held its breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, but no one felt it more than Maya Thompson. She gripped the edge of the defense table, her knuckles turning white. This was it, the moment that would decide her future. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at Maya. His voice was firm, but even. "The court finds the defendant, Maya Thompson, not guilty." The words echoed in Maya's ears. It took a second for them to register, and then cheers erupted throughout the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing. Students, teachers, and even some of the jury members clapped. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mother sobbed quietly beside her, gripping her father's hand. Her father, always the composed one, smiled proudly, his eyes shining with relief. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, inhaling deeply. It was over. She had won. But the real victory wasn't just for her. Principal Leland was immediately placed under investigation. Within hours, his actions were being reviewed by the school board, and legal experts were already weighing in on the consequences of his corruption. The man who had tried to ruin her future was now watching his own crumble. The prosecutor, who had built his case against Maya without real evidence, was fired. Investigators found emails linking him to a coordinated effort to ensure her conviction. The legal community turned its back on him, and just like that, his career was over. And then there were the school policies, the very ones Maya had been fighting against before all of this began. Her case had drawn national attention, sparking conversations about discrimination in public schools. Civil rights organizations stepped in, demanding accountability. Policy changes were already in discussion, and Maya knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the students who would come after her, the ones who would never have to face what she did. As she stepped outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward her, microphones extended, cameras rolling. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, pushed her microphone forward. "Maya, how did you know to fight back?" Maya smiled, her voice strong, "Because I knew I wasn't alone." The crowd buzzed with admiration. Her fight had inspired more people than she ever could have imagined. But what happened next? That stunned everyone. Days after the trial, Maya Thompson sat in her living room, staring at the email on her laptop screen. Her hands trembled as she read the words again, making sure she wasn't dreaming. "Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship to Columbia University." A breath hitched in her throat. This was everything she had worked for, everything they had tried to take from her. And now she had it back. Her mother, standing behind her, let out a joyful gasp. "Maya, baby, you did it." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "They tried to bury you," he said softly, "but you grew stronger." The news of her victory had spread beyond the courtroom. The school board, under immense public pressure, issued a formal apology. Cameras flashed as board members stood stiffly at a press conference, reading from carefully written statements about fairness, justice, and regret. But Maya wasn't satisfied. When a journalist asked her for a response, she stepped forward, eyes steady. "I don't want an apology," she said. "I want justice for every student you've done this to." The silence that followed was deafening, and she meant it. Maya knew her case had opened a door. It had exposed something bigger than just one corrupt principal or one unfair policy. So she decided to do something about it. With the help of civil rights activists and legal experts, Maya founded an organization dedicated to protecting students from racial discrimination in schools. She worked late nights drafting plans, spoke at community meetings, and even met with policymakers who were now listening because she had made them listen. Her movement grew faster than she expected. Students from all over the country reached out, sharing their own stories of injustice. Parents sent letters thanking her for giving them hope. Her name appeared in headlines next to words like changemaker and youth leader. One evening, as she sat at her desk responding to emails, her mother walked in and wrapped her arms around her. "I'm so proud of you, baby." Maya leaned into the hug, closing her eyes for just a moment. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. Because Maya hadn't just won her battle. She had started a movement. Weeks later, Maya found herself standing in front of a packed auditorium, invited to speak at a national education summit. As she walked onto the stage, the applause was overwhelming. She took a deep breath, scanning the faces of students, teachers, and activists who had gathered to hear her speak. She gripped the edges of the podium, steadying herself. "A year ago, I was told my future was over," she began. "That I was a criminal, that I didn't belong in the spaces I had worked so hard to reach. But I knew the truth, and I knew I wasn't alone." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "We all deserve justice, and if they won't give it to us, we'll fight for it ourselves." Thunderous applause followed her words. Maya smiled, knowing this was just the first of many speeches, many fights, many victories to come. She had built something that would last far beyond her own story. She had built a legacy.